The storm was Category 4, with winds gusting to 80 mph. The Air Force's best pilot couldn't land the medical evacuation flight. Lives hung in the balance as the aircraft circled overhead, burning fuel. Then the quiet woman who drove the shuttle bus for 2 years stepped forward and said, "I can bring her down." What happened next shocked everyone who thought they knew Sarah Martinez. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. The first drops of Hurricane Patricia hit Langley Air Force Base at 1847 hours on a Tuesday evening in October. What had started as a tropical depression in the Gulf 3 days earlier had intensified into a monster storm, packing sustained winds of 65 mph with gusts approaching 2. The base had been under evacuation orders since dawn, but one critical mission remained incomplete. Sarah Martinez guided her shuttle bus through the nearly empty base, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the horizontal rain. At 42, she had been driving this same route for exactly 2 years and 17 days, ferrying personnel between barracks, the commissary, medical facilities, and the flight line. Her passengers rarely made conversation beyond requesting their stop, and Sarah preferred it that way. Invisibility was comfortable, predictable, safe. The radio crackled with urgent communications as she completed what would likely be her final circuit before the base went into full lockdown. All non-essential personnel to storm shelters immediately, came the announcement from base command. This is not a drill. Hurricane Patricia will make landfall in approximately 4 hours. Sarah pulled into the motor pool, securing her bus with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything she did. Her movements were economical, practiced, the routine of someone who had found comfort in repetition after learning that unpredictability could be devastating. She wore the same navy blue uniform every day, her graying hair pulled back in the same simple ponytail, her expression carefully neutral. As she walked toward the administrative building to complete her end-of-shift paperwork, the growing wind nearly knocked her off balance. Patricia was still hours away, but her outer bands were already demonstrating the storm's ferocity. Sarah quickened her pace, noting the empty parking lots and secured aircraft that dotted the tarmac like sleeping giants. The base operations center hummed with tense activity despite the evacuation orders. Essential personnel monitored weather data, coordinated with emergency services, and maintained communication with aircraft that had been relocated to safer airfields. Sarah passed through the building's main corridor, heading for the transportation office, when urgent voices from the tower control room caught her attention. Medical Evac 017, you are cleared for immediate landing. Runway 27, be advised, winds are gusting to 180 with severe turbulence below 2,000 feet. Tower, this is Medical Evac 017, came the reply, static distorting the pilot's voice, unable to maintain stable approach. Winds are beyond aircraft limitation, requesting vectors to alternate airfield. Sarah paused in the hallway, her attention drawn to the conversation despite her usual practice of avoiding involvement in operations beyond her scope. Through the open door of the control room, she could see the tension in the air traffic controllers' postures as they huddled around radar screens and communication equipment. Medical Evac 017, negative on alternate airfield, the tower chief responded, his voice tight with stress. All regional airports are below minimums. You're carrying a critical patient with less than 2 hours. Landing here is your only option. Tower, understood, but I cannot safely execute approach in these conditions. Aircraft is not equipped for Category 4 wind speed. Request emergency assistance. Master Sergeant Rebecca Torres, the senior controller on duty, rubbed her temples as she studied the weather data streaming across her monitors. Torres had guided aircraft through countless challenging conditions during her 15-year career, but Hurricane Patricia presented variables beyond normal operational parameters. Options? Torres asked her team, though her tone suggested she already knew the limited nature of their choice. We could try talking them down with enhanced radar guidance, suggested Technical Sergeant Mike Chen, the assistant controller, but with visibility near zero and winds this variable, even our best pilots would struggle. Who's our best pilot available for emergency consultation? Torres inquired, knowing that most of their experienced aviators had been evacuated with the non-essential personnel. Major Davidson is still on base, Chen replied. He's got the most hours in severe weather conditions. Torres nodded grimly. Get him up here. We need all the expertise we can gather. Sarah remained in the hallway, unnoticed by the controllers who were focused entirely on their life and death responsibility. She found herself drawn into the drama despite her instinct to remain invisible. For 2 years she had driven past the flight line twice daily, watching aircraft land and take off with the detached interest of someone observing a world she was no longer part of. But the tension in the control room was undeniable, and the stakes were clearly critical. Major Davidson arrived within minutes, his flight suit damp from the sprint through the worsening weather. At 38, he was considered one of the base's most skilled pilots, with over 3,000 hours in various aircraft and extensive experience in challenging conditions. He immediately took position at the radar console, studying the approaching aircraft's situation. Medical Evac 017, this is Major Davidson. I'm going to talk you through a modified approach that might work in these conditions. Roger, Major Davidson, standing by for guide. For the next 20 minutes, Davidson provided detailed instructions for a complex approach that would theoretically allow the medical evacuation aircraft to land despite the extreme weather. His guidance was precise, technically sound, and based on extensive experience with the specific aircraft type and runway configuration. But as the aircraft began its approach, the wind conditions continued to deteriorate. Patricia's outer bands were intensifying beyond the forecasted parameters, creating turbulence and wind shear that exceeded even Davidson's considerable experience. Tower, I'm getting severe turbulence at 800 feet, the pilot reported, stress evident in his voice. Aircraft is becoming uncontrollable. I have to abort this approach. Davidson's jaw tightened as he watched the aircraft pull up and away from the runway, disappearing into the storm-darkened sky. Medical Evac 017, understand your abort. Circle back for another attempt when conditions allow. Major, fuel state is becoming critical, the pilot responded. I have maybe 2 more approach attempts before I have to declare emergency fuel. Torres exchanged glances with Davidson, both understanding the implication. If the aircraft couldn't land at Langley, the patient aboard would likely die during transfer to a distant alternate airfield. But if they forced an approach in impossible conditions, everyone aboard could be killed. Sir, Chen interjected, studying his weather display. Conditions are only going to get worse. Patricia's eye wall is still 3 hours out, but these outer bands are intensifying. Davidson nodded grimly. Medical Evac 017, I'm going to walk you through a different approach vector. This one's going to be challenging, but it might give us a shot. As Davidson began outlining his second approach strategy, Sarah found herself mentally calculating wind vectors and approach angles based on information she was overhearing. Without conscious intention, she was processing the variables through experience and training that had been dormant for 2 years, but never forgotten. The pilot's second approach attempt lasted 12 minutes before deteriorating conditions forced another abort. Tower, I'm declaring minimum fuel. One more approach, then I have to divert regardless of patient status. The control room fell silent except for the constant chatter of radio communications and the howling wind outside. Torres stared at her radar screen, searching for options that simply didn't exist. Davidson studied weather data, looking for a window of opportunity that wasn't there. There has to be something we're missing, Torres muttered, more to herself than to her team. That's when Sarah stepped through the door. Excuse me, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the ambient noise. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I might be able to help. All heads turned toward the woman in the shuttle driver uniform, whom most of them recognized vaguely, but had never really noticed. Torres looked confused. Davidson appeared annoyed at the interruption, and Chen seemed surprised that anyone besides essential personnel was still in the building. Ma'am, this is a restricted area during emergency operations, Torres said, not unkindly, but firmly. You should be in a storm shelter. I understand, Sarah replied, taking a step into the room. But I've been listening to your situation, and I have experience that might be relevant. Davidson's expression shifted from annoyance to skepticism. What kind of experience? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shatter the carefully constructed invisibility she had maintained for 2 years. I'm a commercial airline pilot, 15 years with major carriers. I've landed in conditions similar to what you're dealing with. The control room fell completely silent. Torres, Davidson, and Chen stared at Sarah as if she had just claimed to be an astronaut. The quiet shuttle driver they had barely noticed for 2 years was suddenly claiming expertise in the exact situation that was stumping their most experienced personnel. "You're a pilot?" Torres asked, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Sarah corrected. "I haven't flown commercially in 2 years, but I've logged over 12,000 hours in everything from regional jets to wide-body aircraft, including approaches in hurricane conditions." Davidson's skepticism was evident. "Ma'am, with all due respect, driving a shuttle bus and flying a commercial airliner are completely different skill sets." "Yes, they are," Sarah agreed calmly, "but the principles of aviation don't change based on your current job title." Torres studied Sarah's face, searching for signs of delusion or desperation that might explain this unexpected claim. What she saw was calm competence and quiet confidence, qualities that didn't typically accompany false claims of expertise. "Can you prove your credentials?" Torres asked. Sarah reached into her wallet and produced a pilot's license that Torres examined carefully. The document was current, properly endorsed, and indicated qualifications for multiple aircraft types, including the medical evacuation plane currently circling over. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Davidson asked, his tone shifting from skepticism to confusion. "Because I'm not a pilot anymore," Sarah replied simply. "I drive a shuttle bus, but right now you have people in trouble, and I might be able to help them." Torres made a command decision that would be reviewed and questioned for months afterward, but felt absolutely right in the moment. "What do you suggest?" Sarah moved to the radar console, studying the approaching aircraft's position and the weather data streaming across the display. Her eyes moved with the focused intensity of someone processing complex information through extensive experience. "The standard approach vectors you've been using assume normal wind patterns," she began, her voice taking on the authority that comes with expertise. "But hurricane conditions create unique challenges that require modified techniques." Davidson leaned closer, his professional curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "Such wind shear in hurricane conditions doesn't follow predictable patterns," Sarah explained, pointing to specific areas on the weather display. "Instead of fighting the wind, there's a technique called riding the gradient that allows you to work with severe wind variations instead of against them." Chen looked up from his console. "I've never heard of that technique." "It's not taught in standard military flight training," Sarah acknowledged. "It was developed by commercial pilots who regularly deal with severe weather over long distances. The military typically has the option to avoid severe conditions. Commercial aviation sometimes doesn't have that luxury." Torres nodded slowly. The explanation made sense, and desperate circumstances called for unconventional solutions. "Can you talk our pilot through this technique?" "I can try," Sarah replied, "but I'll need to communicate directly with the aircraft. The pilot needs to understand exactly what I'm asking him to do and why." "Medical Evac 017, Torres radioed. "We have additional guidance available from someone with extensive hurricane flying experience. Are you willing to accept directions from an alternate source?" "Tower, at this point I'll take guidance from anyone who thinks they can get us down safely," came the immediate reply. Torres handed Sarah the radio microphone, a gesture that represented complete trust in someone she had barely known existed 10 minutes earlier. "You're cleared to provide guidance." Sarah accepted the microphone with steady hands, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with potentially life-saving communication. She keyed the radio with the professional composure that had carried her through 15 years of commercial aviation. "Medical Evac 017. This is Sarah Martinez. I'm going to walk you through a modified approach technique specifically designed for severe wind conditions. Are you familiar with gradient riding?" "Negative on gradient riding," the pilot replied. "What's your background?" 15 years commercial aviation, 12,000 hours, including multiple hurricane penetrations for emergency landings. "I know this sounds unconventional, but I need you to trust the technique." There was a brief pause before the pilot responded. "Roger, understood. At this point conventional approaches aren't working. I'm ready for your guidance." Sarah studied the radar display, calculating the approaching aircraft's position relative to wind patterns and terrain features. Her analysis incorporated variables that Davidson hadn't considered, based on experience with weather systems that military pilots rarely encountered. 017. "Instead of maintaining a steady descent rate, I want you to work with the wind gradient. You're going to ride the updrafts and downdrafts like a controlled roller coaster." Davidson looked skeptical. "That sounds like a recipe for losing control entirely." "Only if you fight it," Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the radar. "The key is reading the wind patterns. and using them for controlled descent rather than maintaining artificial stability. For the next 25 minutes, Sarah guided the medical evacuation aircraft through an approach unlike anything in standard training manual. Her instructions were precise, technically sophisticated, and based on experience that none of the military personnel in the control room possessed. 017. You're going to feel a significant updraft at your current position. Don't compensate. Let it lift you, then use the energy to transition into the downdraft on the leeward side. Roger, I feel the updraft now. The pilot reported. This is actually working. I'm getting more stable control than I've had all evening. Davidson watched the radar display with growing amazement as the aircraft maintained a controlled descent despite wind conditions that had defeated all previous attempts. Sarah's technique wasn't just working. It was providing better control than conventional approaches in normal weather. How did you learn this? Torres asked quietly, not wanting to distract Sarah from her radio work. Trial by fire, Sarah replied without looking away from the radar. When you're responsible for 300 passengers, and Hurricane Andrew is the only weather between you and Miami, you learn techniques they don't teach in flight school. The aircraft continued its unconventional approach, riding wind currents with a precision that seemed to defy the chaos of Hurricane Patricia's outer bands. Sarah's guidance became increasingly specific as the plane descended toward landing altitude. 017. At 500 feet you're going to encounter severe wind shear. Don't try to maintain altitude. Drop with the downdraft. Then use power to control your descent rate rather than your attitude. Roger. Dropping with the downdraft. This is incredible. I have better control now than I did at 2,000 feet. Davidson shook his head in amazement. 15 years of flying, and I've never seen anything like this approach. Different problems require different solutions. Sarah replied, her attention focused entirely on the delicate process of talking an aircraft through conditions that would normally be considered impossible. 017. Runway is now visible. Continue descent using power management only. Let the wind control your attitude. Use throttle to control your rate. Runway in sight, continuing approach. This technique it's like the aircraft wants to land instead of fighting to stay airborne. Torres watched the radar display as the aircraft aligned with the runway in a manner that seemed impossible, given the weather conditions. Sarah's technique had transformed Hurricane Patricia from an enemy to be fought into a force to be partnered with. 017. You're looking good for landing. Maintain current approach. Prepare for touchdown in 30 seconds. The control room held its collective breath as the aircraft disappeared from radar coverage in the final seconds before landing. In severe weather conditions, the moment between approach and confirmed touchdown could stretch into eternity. Tower Medical Evac 017 is down safe, came the pilot's voice, relief evident despite the professional tone. I don't know who provided that guidance, but that was the smoothest hurricane landing I've ever experienced. The control room erupted in cheers and applause. Torres clapped Sarah on the shoulder. Davidson extended his hand in congratulation, and Chen looked at the shuttle driver with new respect. Outstanding work, Torres said, her voice carrying the gratitude of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. That was some of the finest air traffic guidance I've ever seen. Sarah handed the microphone back to Torres with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. Just glad I could help. Davidson was studying weather data and radar recordings from the approach. I need to understand this technique better. What you just did shouldn't be possible in these conditions. It's possible if you change your relationship with the weather, Sarah explained. Instead of treating wind as an obstacle, you treat it as a tool. Commercial aviation teaches you to work with natural forces rather than against them. Where did you learn gradient riding? Chen asked, clearly fascinated by the unconventional approach. Emergency landing in Hurricane Andrew. I was a first officer on a Miami approach when conditions deteriorated beyond anything we'd trained for. My captain knew the technique from his military days, said it was something experimental pilots used for extreme weather testing. Torres looked at Sarah with new curiosity. If you don't mind me asking, why are you driving a shuttle bus instead of flying commercially? The question hung in the air, touching on the personal history that had led Sarah to seek invisibility in a job far below her qualification. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her past would be examined and questions would be asked. Sometimes life changes direction, Sarah said carefully. I needed something different after an incident that made flying complicated. Davidson's expression showed understanding rather than curiosity. Military personnel knew that careers could end suddenly due to circumstances beyond anyone's control,
and that competent people sometimes found themselves in positions that didn't reflect their capabilities. "Well, whatever brought you here," Torres said. "I'm grateful you were available tonight." That medical evacuation was carrying a critically injured soldier from a training accident. "You probably saved his life." As the immediate crisis passed and the control room returned to normal operations, Sarah found herself facing a choice she hadn't anticipated. Her carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered, her hidden expertise revealed, and her relationship with the base permanently changed. "Ma'am," Davidson said as the excitement died down, "would you be interested in discussing your techniques with our flight training division? What you demonstrated tonight could save lives in future emergency situations." Sarah considered the offer, feeling the weight of returning to a world she had deliberately left behind. For 2 years, driving the shuttle bus had provided safety, routine, and distance from the complexities that had ended her commercial flying career. But the events of the evening had reminded her of something she had tried to forget, that her skills could make a difference when people's lives were at stake. "I'd be willing to share what I know," she said finally, "but I want to continue my shuttle duties as well. I've found value in that work." Torres nodded with understanding. Sometimes the best expertise comes from people who aren't actively pursuing recognition for it. As Hurricane Patricia continued its approach toward landfall, Sarah returned to her shuttle bus in the motor pool, securing it for the storm with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the quiet woman who drove the same route every day. The medical evacuation aircraft sat safely on the tarmac, its critical patient transferred to the base hospital where specialized care would determine whether Sarah's intervention had been successful. The pilot who had executed the impossible landing would submit a report crediting exceptional ground guidance for the mission's success. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez was officially designated as a civilian flight consultant for Langley Air Force Base, splitting her time between shuttle driving and emergency aviation support. Her gradient riding technique became part of the curriculum for extreme weather flying, and her story became legend among pilots who faced impossible conditions. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that hiding from her past hadn't eliminated it. It had simply postponed the moment when her expertise would be needed again. Sometimes the most important skills are the ones we carry quietly, waiting for the moment when staying invisible is no longer an option. The hurricane had passed, the emergency was over, and the lives that hung in the balance had been saved. The shuttle driver who shocked the Air Force had proven that extraordinary abilities often travel incognito, and that the person driving you to your destination might just be the one who can guide you safely through the storm.